To kick off this morning's conversation with his idea of what Indo-Pacific means when you sit in Dhaka, which is, as we heard this morning, one of the most exciting regions of the world, fastest growing regions of the world, and a miracle country not only because of the transformation, but I think you're one of the few countries that has great relationship with all the big powers. So in that sense, when you're sitting in Dhaka, what does the word Indo-Pacific evoke?
Thank you, Samir. Good afternoon to everyone. You probably couldn't be any better when you say that what is my personal definition of Indo-Pacific, because the definition of Indo-Pacific is still evolving. It's not only in case of me as a person, but Bangladesh, beyond India, in the neighborhood. Obviously, India is, led by, or even though he's not a government entity anymore, but Admiral Khurana first pitched this idea of Indo-Pacific in this region. But what we have seen in last 12 years, very specific initiative from Japan, when I remember Shinzo Abe visited Delhi in 2007, he mentioned the very word of Indo-Pacific. And then we have seen United States of America came forward with two very specific acts, the ARIA Act and the BUILD Act. And at the same time, I'm not sure exactly, but it's depending on which side of the table you are sitting. The Belt and Road Initiative of China can be termed as an Indo-Pacific initiative as well. But it's actually a work in progress. But what we largely understand sitting in Bangladesh, and probably sitting right in the middle of Indo-Pacific, starting from United shores of United States to let's say Madagascar, or from Hawaii to Madagascar, we understand a better cooperation for the region, and that length from Madagascar to Hawaii is actually Asia. And Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina also mentioned during her speech this morning is that this is Asian century, and that's why probably the economic power of the world, the political power, the bigger power of the world is concentrating in this region. And obviously they need a vehicle, they need some policies, some legal frameworks, but we don't have a platform as yet. It's still fluid, but putting that discussion aside, and there is a session dedicated to the strategic part or the political part of Indo-Pacific tomorrow morning at 9:30. So all of you are welcome to join again. But the economic potential of this region, the Asian century, as you all know, that the world wealth used to be located somewhere in Asia, and it's coming back after a couple of centuries. And this is the time for the countries, let's say we have about 40, 45 countries in this region that falls within this Madagascar, Hawaii, or US definition. We need to come closer. We need to remove trade barriers. We need to exchange more. We need to cooperate better. We need to have a conducive business environment and trade environment. We shouldn't reinvent the wheel. But obviously, within this band, ASEAN is a major player, and ASEAN do have a very solid legal framework in place. And countries outside ASEAN, like ourselves, is having difficulty to trade with these countries. Yes, obviously, we have bilateral instruments in place, bilateral agreements in place, but the door of ASEAN is shut for almost a decade. We are aspiring to be a dialogue partner, but they have their own agenda to pursue, which we fully understand and respect and appreciate. but an emerging country like Bangladesh should be given equal opportunity to join these great, fantastic initiatives, so we can learn faster and we don't need to, we don't waste resources trying reinventing the wheel, as I said. So, you know, I would probably at these opening remarks will stop here saying that to me, Indo-Pacific, when it comes to growth and development, it comes to, you know, trade cooperation, investment cooperation, maritime cooperation, marine digital cooperation, you know, harnessing marine resources in a manner that is eco-friendly, and not you know, lose out or fall into the trap of if there is any other agenda beyond these economic objectives.
High Commissioner, let me ask you, I mean, like we were discussing, Australia is truly an Indo-Pacific country. It has both the oceans on its shorelines. Sitting where you do, at the top of the world or in the bottom of the world, whichever way you want to turn the map, how do you see this region emerging, or this idea of the Indo-Pacific emerging? What does it really mean for you? Is it a political play? Is it a security framework? Is it about trade and economics and the opportunity that the 21st century brings with it?
Thank you very much, Samir, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this great big picture discussion about these issues. The Indo-Pacific is a much discussed concept in many different fora, and it obviously means different things to different countries. In Australia, we use the term Indo-Pacific because we recognise that Australia's security and prosperity are greatly affected by developments in those countries. So this is how we go forward in our foreign policy, in our engagement with all states in the Indo-Pacific. And I guess I could summarise in a nutshell that this is really a strategic and economic entity. It's not a specific geographic entity, but it does really reflect the strategic and economic reality of our part of the world today. And I just want to pick up on a couple of things that the Honourable State Minister raised around growth, and I agree that this is one of the fastest growing and most dynamic regions in the world. And I understand that nearly 2/3 of global growth by 2030 will be in for economic growth. If we want to project our views on human rights in this region, then we look for opportunities to do that with countries that with whom we have shared interests. And I'll give you an example. An example is that the forum called IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, is perhaps the first formal piece of regional architecture to tackle Indian Ocean rim countries' shared interests. So those interests, including those of large countries like Australia, Indonesia and Indonesia, are also shared with smaller island countries.
Correct.
And we have a lot of interest in talking together about economic growth, about opportunities for women's economic empowerment and gender equality, about harnessing the blue economy, about maritime safety and security. All these things impact on each of the countries. So this was a forum that didn't exist until reasonably recently, and it's an example of how you can work with countries where you have shared interests.
So this is within the last decade that this forum has come into its own. Mr. Madhav, India has in many ways promoted the idea of the Indo-Pacific, and clearly with everything that India does, it is with an Indian flavor. Now, what does the Indo-Pacific mean for those of us who have heard the Japanese Prime Minister speak about it, who have heard successive American governments promote it, and now who have seen a very consistent pitch from the Indian government to create a new political arrangement for the 21st century? What should we expect from it?
Thank you, Samir. Firstly, India's whole outlook about the Indian Ocean or Indo-Pacific is that we are not creating any special region or regional arrangement here. Indo-Pacific is a natural region. In the history of politics, we tried to create regions. In the last century, we have created what we called as Asia-Pacific. it was a creation of, it was an artificial arrangement between two continents. Not even two continents. One was a continent, landmass, the other was an ocean. Whereas when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, we are talking about a natural region. When I say natural region, when I emphasize on that point, what I'm trying to emphasize is for India. It's not any political arrangement. It's not any special strategic arrangement. It is a natural region that is existing. We have to deal with that reality. Secondly, why we are discussing about that region today in Dhaka, in Washington, all over the world, is because this region in the 21st century has emerged as the most happening region. It is here, as Honorable Prime Minister has also rightly mentioned earlier, it is here that 50% of the world's population lives. It is here that the 60% of world's GDP exists. It is here that the fastest growing economies exist. It is through this region that 60% of the container trade happens, 80% of the energy trade happens. It is the most happening region today. And one of the scholars from Singapore has come out with this very interesting, fascinating idea of the shift of global power axis. And her conclusion was that in the 21st century, the global power axis is gradually shifting towards the Indo-Pacific region. It will settle down by 2030 firmly in the Indo-Pacific region. So we all have to realize that it is not about any strategic or political arrangement. It's about appreciating a reality. It took time for countries.
Correct.
You know, when we proposed from India, when Indian Prime Minister Modi started talking about Indo-Pacific on the international fora, even the Americans were not ready to adopt that phrase. I remember Admiral Harry Harris at the Halifax International Forum calling it Indo-Asia Pacific.
That's right.
Because the whole idea was that if we call it Indo-Pacific, probably somebody else will be offended. Sir, Indo-Pacific, just because it has the name India doesn't belong to India. Just as South China Sea doesn't belong to China. It's a natural region. And I know even to this day, countries like Russia, I know scholars in Russia, I know political establishment, political leadership in Russia, which simply refuses to acknowledge that there is anything like Indo-Pacific exists. They say, no, we are happy with Asia-Pacific. That's why I'm saying if you look at it from any strategic, political point of view, you will encounter problems. But if you look at it as a reality, as a region to deal with, then your whole approach changes. And in this region, India, as one of the major powers, just as Indian Ocean is central to Indo-Pacific, India is central to Indian Ocean. In Indo-Pacific, it is the ASEAN which is central. You have mentioned about Australia and Indonesia sharing the waters of both the oceans. I would say the real bridge between Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific is the ASEAN group of nations. They are the bridge. With their centrality, we have to all work together. It's about stakeholdership. You say Asia-Pacific, you are excluding all the European nations. But if you talk about Indo-Pacific, you have France there, you have Germany there, you have Britain there, you have so many, Australia of course is there, Japan there. So it is about stakeholdership. We have to respect this stakeholdership formula here. And most important, the key word here, I am sure about which we have to talk, is not trade. It will happen, it's a natural phenomena. Sovereignties will be respected. The key is rule-based order. If this is the most happening region, how do you ensure rule-based order here? Only point I make and close. We have framed rules under the United Nations organizations, various organizations including UNCLOS and all, in the last century. When we framed those rules, it was not Indo-Pacific which was central to global affairs. It was Pacific Atlantic. So you had Europe, you had the Pacific nations in mind when you came up with a number of guidelines, number of laws, number of rules. Now it is a different region, different civilization, different atmosphere, different culture, different situations. You have to, first of all, have a complete relook at all those rules, all those regulations. It has to be Indo-Pacific centric. So you have to come up with necessary modifications. But secondly, the critical question is, how do you ensure that every nation in this region, or for that matter in the world, accepts them and follows them? That is the big question before all of us today.
But sir, you will have to answer that question. I'm going to, my next question to you is exactly this, that you have rightly said that there is a time to revisit and perhaps reframe and sometimes rewrite the rules of the road for this century, which is going to be Indo-Pacific centered century. Two big actors who also hold quite powerful pens, for example, the Russians and the Chinese, have not necessarily bought onto this definition that you've just outlined for us, that it's a natural region and it's a natural organic evolution. I'm going to come to you as well, Minister, for a response to this. But let me ask you, sir, first, that how do we ensure that as we think of these new arrangements for the future, each of these large actors and small actors participate wholesomely in this process?
One thing that we all have to realize is that whenever we think about coming up with new rules-based order or maybe tweaked rules-based order in this region, don't limit the right to frame it to certain big powers. Please don't do that. Let Maldives also be a player in that. Let Bangladesh be also a player in that. Let small island nations, you know, when you talk of strategy or, strategic importance in this region, please read the history of 18th and 19th century. The most critical elements of the strategy in this region have always been smaller countries,
correct,
island nations. It is around those island nations that entire global politics used to, hover. So please bring countries like Bangladesh, countries like, of course, Singapore has always been an important player. ASEAN has always been an important player. Even I would say smaller countries, Seychelles should be a partner in this. Maldives should be a partner in this. Why only big countries should decide about the future of this region? So the important point is, since there was a mention about 45 countries, I would say 20-25 countries in the Indian Ocean region have to be integral partners in building up and coming up with a new rules-based order in this region, because they are critical to the future of this region.
Veerle, I'm going to turn to you for two reasons. One, because the institute you work in has a long history of engaging with and studying this region, perhaps also, chronicling the evolution of this region. But in another sense, you are Dutch. And since he mentioned smaller countries have defined a rules-based order for a very long time, I think the Dutch played a very important role in creating what we today call the normative framework for the rules-based order. Sitting where you do, how do you see the political dynamics play out? What are the security cleavages which will need to be confronted if we need to go to that utopia of everyone participating wholesomely? And where are the flashpoints or the actors who are going to respond to those flashpoints?
Thank you so much, Samir. Yeah, I think so many of the points raised already are fascinating, and I think it really lies at the heart of this discussion around the Indo-Pacific. He who rules the seas rules the world, and it's no surprise to me, therefore, that this concept of the Indo-Pacific, which unites two of the most, I think, competitive and dynamic oceans of the world, is really creating a lot of anxiety amongst some, but also a lot of anticipation for opportunity amongst others. I think some of the flashpoints really that we're coming up against is what are the rules that we're looking at? So we've heard already the mention of the rules-based international order, and that this needs to be re-examined. And I mean, when we talk about this phrase, what does that really mean? There are political rules, there are security norms, there are investment norms, there are economic agreements. And so there's a real whole body of legislation and interpretation of international rules and norms that we're looking at here. And I think what we're seeing is a contestation around which stay and which deserve some reform, or whether we need new ones altogether. And that spans a huge amount of different sectors and a huge amount of influence as well, potentially driven by specific countries. And maybe one thing that I do want to add is, there was a comment just now about why do big countries only get to make the decisions. And I'd actually argue that with this whole discussion around the Indo-Pacific, it's actually the smaller nations that are benefiting hugely. It's interesting that with the drive of this concept of the Indo-Pacific, a huge amount of tension and a huge amount of investment is turning towards this region. And with that comes a lot of, I think, hedging that we're seeing going on between countries. And we see also a lot of concentration of decision-making actually landing within these smaller countries that were mentioned recently. So with all this attention comes also a lot of opportunity.
And flashpoints?
Flashpoints, like I said, maritime powers are, of course, becoming the growing, I think, force at the moment. We see China really driving up its maritime ambitions. The United States, of course, hugely concerned, and other countries as well. But I think with this anticipation of economic investment, we talk a lot about dual-use infrastructure as well. I think that's a flashpoint. We seem to recently as well, every time we talk about a port, we start obviously or automatically speaking about basing options as well at the same time. So that, I think, is a flashpoint where we need to perhaps really reflect and take a closer examination as to what's going on the ground. And then also flashpoints in terms of access to economic resources in the seas. As we all develop our own blue economy strategies, as we all engage more in shipping and fisheries and trade.
In the oceans.
There's going to be competition in the oceans, absolutely.
And again, for that you require frameworks to manage.
You do, absolutely. And then on that topic of frameworks, of course, ASEAN and the moratorium to dialogue partnerships was already mentioned. IORA was also mentioned. But I would point towards also just pure functionalism, countries coming together in small groupings, acting where necessary. And that's perhaps a way to get around this issue of a feeling of current existing frameworks not being sufficient or up to task.
So the informal institutions that emerge with a cluster of like-minded countries is also a way to
drive initiatives forward, exactly, and get the
you
ball
want
rolling.
to come in, High Commissioner, on this?
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment that was mentioned in the Honourable Prime Minister's speech about the delimitation of Bangladesh's maritime boundaries with India and Myanmar as a great example of how the international rules-based order serves the interests of states in now enabling Bangladesh to harness the resources that are in its sovereign territory in the sea. But I also wanted just to elaborate a little bit on the issue of flashpoints. We think of flashpoints as big issues with a lot of impact, but perhaps we also need to think of other regional security challenges that might take a long time to grow, but can impact quite seriously on countries of the region. And I'm thinking of things like violent extremism, I'm thinking of irregular migration, I'm thinking of human rights violations that result in people moving across borders, and also piracy, illegal fishing, all of those things that actually have the potential to become very substantial
festering
problems that countries need to talk together to try and resolve.
So let's come to you now. I think there are two questions to you. I mean, there are many in your mind in terms of ideas that you want to share, but two specifically. One was that is it time now that Dhaka Consensus should become a reality? Is it time for Bangladesh to take the lead in putting together this new arrangements or a cluster of arrangements which will manage the blue economy issues, migration issues, because you're affected by all of it, right? And also the balance of power questions in terms of the rising maritime ambitions and oceans contest. So that is the one. Is it time for the 30th largest GDP of the world with 170 million people to now put forward a new vision for the future, which big and small powers can buy into? And the second is that, Bangladesh has been a beneficiary of what Veerle mentioned was increased focus on the region. You got investments from the Japanese, the Chinese, the Indians, the Americans, everyone wants to be in Bangladesh. How do you ensure that this attention does not create dual use or disturbing investments which will destabilize both the region and domestic politics?
I'm not sure whether Dhaka or Bangladesh should take the lead, but having said that, I'm probably just reminding myself and the audience that Dhaka has, taken the lead, especially in migration. A couple of years ago, we have hosted our global forum on migration. Thousands participants, and within the UN system, we have very specific responsibilities to improve the entire migration scenario of the world, not just region. Having said that, we have our own issues with irregular migrations, but we are already there. And what Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina reminded us is these two are the glaring example for the world that disputed, or that's a very harsh word, the differences between neighbors can be resolved amicably through discussions and respecting the rule-based order. Let's say, we went to UNCLOS and, we accepted happily and, but while we say that rule-based order, let's say within this Indo-Pacific, out of, let's say, 40, 50 countries, half of these are small island developing states, SEED. And their biggest enemy, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina reminded us, and we are in full agreement with Prime Minister Modi as well, within SAARC countries, that poverty is our biggest, largest enemy. But go and ask these small island developing states, they would say climate change is the biggest enemy. And, I think there are issues with major economies of the world where, exiting Paris Agreement is not going to help the cause of these Pacific countries. So, we need to be mindful of that as well. Whether or not, Mr. Ram Madhav went on to say it's a natural bonding between Indo-Pacific countries. I fully agree. But at the same time, if we want to propel the growth further, and the world is looking at us and investing at us, and not just Bangladesh, for the region, Asian century and all that, if you want to propel, we need to invest in institutions. We need to come closer, not probably strictly legally binding agreement, but large understanding on important issues.
So to both you and Mr. Madhav, let me pose a question. One institution which none of you have mentioned, and in a sense that itself tells the story, is BIMSTEC. Why is it that an institution like BIMSTEC can't be a force for good in many of these objectives? So let me come to you and then I'll come to you as well.
Okay.
Or you want to take that first?
I just wanted to finish on the first one, but we'll let Mr. Ram speak. It said Bangladesh is a beneficiary. It's not that world is giving us. We created an environment. It's the political leadership created an environment. The people of this country, 160 million people, went on to create the opportunity for themselves. And when some accomplishment happens, there are people who would say it probably happened naturally. It was destined to come to Bangladesh, but it's not. We had to work for every single dollar out of this $40 billion export. We had to work really hard to make it a $300 billion economy, to be listed in the top 30, to attract global investors. But while we are in this process, obviously, as we practice this policy in our foreign affairs, that friendship to all, allies to none, that means, we want to be in almost equal term with every other country. And, that's why we are one of the first countries in the region to say yes to Belt and Road Initiative. But at the same time, we are mindful of the challenges that comes with it as well. Okay. So as long as we are mindful and taking the right step at the right moment, the future is still brighter or better for countries like Bangladesh. But if you can allow me to say on the BIMSTEC, we would expect the member countries, Bangladesh, the Secretary General of BIMSTEC is here somewhere. I'm sure we want the member states to come and act and take lead. There are so many things, and if you allow 5 minutes from the audience, and he can probably interfere, is that the first priority of BIMSTEC is go for a liberal trade regime for the member states, and the Secretariat is working, and if we can achieve even 50% of what of the ambition, I think it will be fantastic, because intra trade of these BIMSTEC countries, we know, it's minuscule. I remember the SARC figures, that is about 4%. BIMSTEC could be just, a couple of notches higher, probably still in single digit.
Madhavji.
Let me say a word or two about the flashpoints you talked about. Flashpoints are different from the challenges that we face. Poverty, issues like that are all challenges that we all have to collectively face. But flashpoints are those. I am reminded of the kind of colonial politics that used to be practiced by those powers in the 19th century and early 20th century. Those used to be in this, especially in our region, those used to be centered around smaller islands. The more number of islands you capture, the more influential you will become in this region. Not to be offending, not to be offensive to anybody, even countries like Australia have 2.5 kilometer long runways on islands where no people exist. Cocos Island has a 2.5 kilometer long runway, but hardly 500 people live there. Why? Because that used to be the thinking those days. I'm afraid that is returning to this region. What you see happening in South China Sea area, East China Sea area, and same thing is now probably compelling other countries also to look to such kind of politics again, has the potential to become a very big flashpoint here in this region. It's a natural region. It has to help free flow of trade, free flow of overflights. It has to be a free region. Respecting sovereignty of all the countries, it has to be a free region. But if we create 20th century, 19th century colonial politics centered around capturing lands and creating islands again, that's bound to create major flashpoints in parts of this region, which we all have to avoid. That's why I insisted we need to seriously think about, one, coming up with a proper rule-based order here. Secondly, convincing all the countries to adhere to it. When we had an issue between India and Bangladesh, we strictly followed UNCLOS guidelines and settled the issue between our two countries. And I can tell you, even to this day, there are people, scholars in India, who believe that India has lost it's a loss to India. That agreement was a loss to India. There are people who believe. But still, we respected the UNCLOS arrangement, those guidelines. We followed them. Even if it meant some loss to India, we agreed. Because after all, we have to follow certain rule-based order. Do all countries think on those lines? It's a big question to be addressed in this region. What happened between China and Philippines? UNCLOS order was there, but is anybody following it? And why, if I can be a little provocative, let me bring in an issue not necessarily related to this region, but only to buttress on that point of respecting agreements, the Hong Kong issue. An agreement arrived at in 1984 between Madam Thatcher and, if I remember correctly, Zhao Jiang, that for 50 years, absolute autonomy will be maintained. But today the Chinese leadership says no. In 20 years they said no need for following that guideline. If countries do not accept the rule-based order, what do? That is the kind of flashpoint that we have to address. As far as BIMSTEC is concerned, BIMSTEC is a regional arrangement between countries in the Bay of Bengal, among the countries in the Bay of Bengal region. We are working towards helping each other develop, prosper well in this region. But today, when we look at the situation from BIMSTEC, we have now grown to, a number of new arrangements have come up. Indian Ocean is emerging as a new arrangement today. In fact, I would say that since we are talking about implementing, building the rules, but also implementing them, I would say that Indian Ocean should come together, countries of the Indian Ocean should come together to form a kind of a loose, not exactly same, but a loose arrangement like European Parliament. Why not Indian Ocean Parliament of countries coming together and talking about the challenges that this region faces? So we have to have our regional arrangements. We will work for the betterment of our regions, but also look at the larger picture emerging in the Indo-Pacific region.
Veerle, do you want to come in on this particular intervention on the revertal to 19th or 20th century politics? Do you see that happening? Do you see the super sovereigns coming back into the domain again of security? We were all focused with non-traditional security for the last 10, 15 years. Suddenly we see that traditional security is back in fashion.
Sure, I mean, I think, as was already said, I mean, this great power play in particular in geopolitics seems to have returned. But, whereas I think the real problematic element here as well is that there's a lot of non-traditional kind of areas of this playing out at the same time. So it's no longer just an issue of territorial acquisition and all of that. It's, how our traditional leaders or leaders that we've looked to in the international system so far, like the United States, for example, as a rule setter, what does it mean when the United States withdraws from the climate change agreement? What does it mean when the United States withdraws from the JCPOA? We've got, regional free trade agreements as well being dialed back now. And I think that's a way in which, we are seeing new challenges to the international system that are being played out by great powers. But that's also where I think the rest of us have to come up and fill that void or fill that gap.
I'm going to now touch a bit on the SDGs specifically. And I'm going to ask you all in terms of what are the largest opportunities to catalyze finance and expertise to support the human development project that all of us are engaged in. And second, where are we failing, again as a group, in terms of being able to fund enough the right projects that can lead to some of the salvations. And even as I come to you to all of this, let me make another announcement. So those of you who have questions can walk to the mics. You see there are, I think, close to 8 mics in the hall. You can walk to one of the mics closest to you, which is right behind you, sir. You can walk to those mics. Take your positions there. I will bring you in the order of your standing near the mic, right? So you can just take it in. So let me start with Julia on this. SDGs and the Indo-Pacific. It's a very exciting political conversation. It's a very deep security conversation. But the real issues here are of development and growth. And are we doing enough in the region to emphasize and focus and deploy funds and resources and political capital to respond to that?
Thank you very much, Samir. If I can just start by saying Australia's contributing about $4 billion to development in the Indo-Pacific. We're a strong supporter of the SDGs, and we're working closely with many countries in the region to help them deliver the lifting out of poverty that is so important to their people. I think there are a number of challenges that many countries face with implementing the SDGs or achieving them, and that goes to the issue you raised around making sure that sufficient funds can be harnessed to help lift people out of poverty. And while there are traditional development relationships between many donors and countries, there are also opportunities to harness other means to help lift people out of poverty. And so that means things like working more with the private sector and looking how the private sector can actually advance development in some of these countries, but also helping countries to mobilise their own domestic resources in order to address some of the development challenges. I think we should always be looking at how we can best harness the capabilities of a range of partners, not just look at the traditional donor development recipient relationship. And I think as we go through the journey towards implementing the SDGs, we've got to be really mindful of some of the institutional strengthening that's quite important. So really good governance, including democratic governance, is really important. Making sure there are robust institutions that can help manage a whole lot of things that address poverty. So that includes things like a strong and flourishing business sector and banking sector, good institutions of the state. But we also think there are some other thematic issues that are really vitally important. And for me, one of the most important issues in development is around gender equality. Bangladesh has a very good story to tell on this, but it's an incomplete story. And I think if we consider that 50% of the world's population is going to be left behind in development, it's actually not going to be good for anybody. And in Bangladesh, we see some great achievements have been made. We're strong supporters of girls having access to education, not just in terms of enrolments, but also in completing their education. We're very strongly advocating participation of women in all areas of decision making in society. We're really keen to look at economic empowerment opportunities, and that includes work around financial inclusion that I know Bangladesh has taken great strides in, but also with digital transformation across the region. We need to make sure that women and girls are not left behind and they get to participate in and get the benefits from digital transformation. So see, these are some of the challenges, and these are areas where Australia is working very actively in.
Mr. Minister, can I ask you to talk a bit about this particular area?
When SDG goals, targets were adopted 4 years ago, Bangladesh was one of the top achiever of MDG that were adopted in 2000. Now, as far as the funding of SDGs are concerned, the two elements, or one rather, the contribution of private sector, government that age-old donations from the economic superpowers to the poorest of the nations. That model largely has failed. If you look into the African struggles, the investments made by many countries in the West paid a very little dividend, because businesses and private sector have a profit motive. That's why things are a little more tidier. There's a business model behind it. And that's why Mr. Madhav went on to suggest for a, let there be a loose arrangement in place like the European Parliament. But why not a business forum? Why not financial institutions that will prioritize projects among these countries? Why not a business forum or someone, something intra-governmental that will address the physical difficulties, the connectivities, the logistics of these countries? 60% of global trade, 60-70% of the world population, and the ships, the number of ocean-going vessels of the world, 70-80% plies through these waters, but still there are difficulties. Yes, we have addressed the piracy issues, but is that really permanent? I mean, we are still spending a lot of resources behind it. Free flow of capital, and that's why even in institutions like, let's say, BIMSTEC, you actually asked the right question, and none of us mentioned this in our opening remarks. Is if we can make BIMSTEC operational, you have ASEAN, you have BIMSTEC, you have good 20-25 countries covered, and obviously, economies like Australia, New Zealand, and Malaysia and Indonesia, obviously, they have closer ties and, preferential trade agreement between these two countries, not beyond ASEAN framework. So, activating BIMSTEC, and once BIMSTEC starts performing, that will take care of the issues of these 7-8 member states. So I think the way forward should be encourage private sectors as well. And obviously, governments can come into play in terms of technology transfers. And also, countries with money I was discussing just before the session that the IMF boss went on to say other day at World Economic Forum meeting that she doesn't want the countries to look up to the Western large consulting firm to tell them what needs to be done. Rather, it should be homegrown. And that is something we have been telling to the world, to our partners, development partners, that you must respect our homegrown policies, because we know our backyards better than you do. So yes,
Excellent.
respecting the homegrown policies and mobilizing private finance, probably the solution.
I'm going to come to Ram Madhavji a little later on India's role as a development actor and a contributor to SDGs, but let me first take a couple of interventions from the audience. So please introduce yourself and...
Yeah, okay. My name is Alhaj Muhammad Fazlul Haq. I am Vice President of Asian Youth Council and Chairman of Jatiya Tarun Sangh, the National Youth and Social Welfare Council of Bangladesh. Thanks, Mr. Moderator and the panelists. It reminds me that the Asia Pacific, even the Indo-Pacific, not a very new idea. While I was a student in England, I remember Commonwealth Youth Affairs Council. In India, Chandigarh, we have the Asia Pacific Youth Training Center, where I meet the youth from Australia, Canada, and these small island countries in the Pacific. What you're discussing today, that was a dreaming in our mind also. And I remember in the International Youth Year, we have the planning meeting in ESCAP in Bangkok, where also Asian Pacific youth were there. What in my opinion, is this: in a changing world, we need to go into action.
Is there a question? Is there a question?
Just I'm coming. My first thing is that we must reduce corruption and increase people's participation if we have to achieve real tour development. And my question to all of you, that if you try a future involving more youth, why don't you organize Dhaka Global Youth Dialogue regularly, like in Malaysia, they organize Malacca International Youth Dialogue yearly. We'll support it. Thank you very much.
So I think he's saying that we should emphasize on the youth, which is a great point, and I want to come to you, the young people. But ma'am, please. Can you also introduce yourself? No, I don't think we can hear you. Is the mic working? Yeah, we can hear you now.
Is it better now?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm Turi Afroz, a lawyer representing Bangladesh. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity. The session is all about growth and development. We all know that growth is only a number, and development means much more than that. I have three little questions, very little questions. The first question is, as far as the Indo-Pacific area is concerned, there is difficulties in understanding or the perception regarding the area. Some of you say it about a more specific, some of you say it's a natural one. Apart from that, my question is, how far sovereign equality of states be ensured or is a reality in this region? My second question, of course, we are talking about the region, about trade, commerce, politics, security, various dynamics. As it has been mentioned that poverty is the biggest enemy, so my next question is, how far the distributive justice of resources be a concern for this region?
Okay.
And my third question, we all know about ASEAN, SAARC, Asia-Pacific, BIMSTEC. How far, what lessons do their success or failure, I would say both, offer for this region?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. For this round, let me take one more intervention. Sir, please introduce yourself.
My name is Shamsher Mubin Chaudhry. I'm a former Foreign Secretary. I wanted to make a comment, but because of time constraints, I won't. I wanted to say what Bangladesh brings to the table that we're discussing about the future of Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, whatever you want to call it. My question is that the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said the Indian and the Pacific Ocean are couplings of the seas of freedom and prosperity. On the other hand, going back historically, the Chinese Admiral Zhang He, who had traveled extensively in our part of the world, has said that we want to build a peaceful world based on trade. Trade means economic diplomacy. Now, is there a conflict between, as a follow-up to this, is there a conflict between, or is a potential conflict between the Belt and Road Initiative on the one hand and the Asia-Pacific strategy on the other? The other question, which is slightly somewhat of a follow-up what Tuheen Afroz had asked, when smaller countries like Bangladesh bring something forward, and you said, Dr. Saran, yourself, the country should, like Bangladesh, should take lead in many cases. We did. We did give South Asia SARC, and now we see it has gone out of our control because smaller countries effectively have a more proactive, are forced into a proactive role than being reactive or creative. So how do we see, even if Bangladesh takes a lead, this will not become casualty to differences of views and opinions of bigger players? My last question is, Dr. Madhav talked of greatly of the need for rule-based order, and we discussed this in Delhi when he spared time to have a meeting with me. We believe in rule-based order. We want to play by the rule-based order. But when major players pull out of rule-based orders, whether it's climate change or global trade or the law of the sea, then what does that put countries like Bangladesh in, and how does Bangladesh react to that? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we will come back if we have more time. Let me now go back to the panelists. I think you have a rich bouquet of 7 interventions between 3 of them. Just for the future, please do restrict yourselves to 1 question each. But sir, let me start with you.
Yeah, I'll start responding with disagreeing, calling Bangladesh as a small country.
Correct.
You know, in no consideration, Bangladesh is small any longer. You know, we need to come out of that mindset. But whether Bangladesh will take the lead or not, but you know, obviously this is a sensitive, and you stated the obvious that potentially there is a conflict, you know, between the Indo-Pacific strategy, IPS and BRI. But the countries that falls, you know, that within this band, you know, what I went on to say as Madagascar to Hawaii is, you know, we need to you know, play it smarter, and we need to be very careful as it evolves to position ourselves. But you know, obviously, as I went on to say, and what also Mr. Madhav mentioned, that once these ideas were floated, let's say since 2007, I'm not referring back to the German scholar who pitched the idea first about 100 years ago, but we need to play it really carefully. And what Tuheen Appa said is, you know, I'm not an expert on ASEAN. I'm not sure, you know, about the other contributors here. But, you know, there are so many things to learn. You know, there are so many things to learn just also beyond the region. You know, when we, you know, I remember attending the second BIMSTEC summit, and, you know, Bangladesh inked the agreement with other countries to set up the secretariat here. And we all said that we aspire to follow the European Union model. Now that's probably the ultimate, but you know, we are nowhere near there yet. You know, that's required some serious working and contribution from the member states.
Veerle?
Sure. Maybe just about Belt and Road versus free and open Indo-Pacific. I wish we would stop talking about these 2 ideas as being necessarily antagonistic or mutually exclusive. They can both coexist at the same time. And I think the point was already mentioned that Belt and Road can even be seen as an Indo-Pacific initiative in and of itself, given its breadth, geographic extent. So I wish we would stop dividing those 2 ideas and say, how can we make sure that all the investments that are flooding into this region are sustainable, impact the local communities in the best way possible, are economically viable. And I think the way that we do that is to work together on these projects. If we can't work together on specific projects, then we work on parallel initiatives side by side. And I think that's one way that we can help make sure that countries' development, you know, economic growth, that was mentioned by somebody in the audience, is one thing, but development is another altogether. And by making sure that we discuss and we debate the impact of some of these projects, regardless of who's doing them, then I think we get to the heart of development and making sure that these countries move forward. And then perhaps on what can we learn, ASEAN was mentioned. You know, I think we have a huge amount to learn from ASEAN And I think it's also worth being said that not every regional organization aspires to be the European Union. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine as well. I think what we can learn is that there are different solutions for different groupings of countries and regions, and there is not one size fits all. So it is whatever works best for those who are participating in that format.
And what about the point on while the countries take lead in creating and pushing for new norms and ideas, we have some big actors who decide to subvert them. And how do you get around that challenge? The climate change was mentioned as by the minister as well earlier. How do you get big actors to respect the rules-based order?
It's difficult to force big actors to respect the rules-based order, but there is something to be said for, I think, as I mentioned earlier, filling that void that's left behind and coming together with the greatest number possible to try and create that framework in which they should then hopefully choose to come back into. But yeah, I mean, it is a shame, of course, to see major countries who play a leading role in the world step away from rules-based agreements and frameworks. And I think it's up to everybody else to take the lead in that respect and stay strong and continue to push forward the norms and the objectives that were agreed earlier.
So,
India is actively engaged in helping a number of countries in the region and beyond in achieving the sustainable development goals. Our Prime Minister has gone all the way to Fiji to engage with the small nations of South Pacific Islands as well. So it is a process in which we are actively engaged. We will continue to support nations achieving targets of SDGs. For countries to achieve these goals, 2 or 3 things are very important. One is democratic values. Second is good governance. And third is peace. Big countries in the region have to help other countries in achieving these 3. It's not just about giving money. It's not just about spending some resources. It's also about promoting these values. You see a new kind of poverty is emerging in this region. Pardon me for saying this. The poverty of the nations. Do you know that nations are becoming debt-ridden in this region now? Hugely debt-ridden. New debts are being imposed in the name of development. We are inventing non-existing theories like, maritime Silk Road never existed in history. But we invented it. And we now are pushing countries into debts. Now, if countries are pushed into debt traps, do you expect those countries to achieve SDGs and MDGs and all that? So we have to have careful systems in place in this region. We are not against countries coming up with new ideas, but they have to be collective ideas. When I said countries like Bangladesh should come forward, it's not about leading or championing a new idea. It's about taking more proactive role in a collective idea. And for bigger powers to recognize that it's not just their own domain to formulate policies and theories and force the 198 countries to follow. It is for all of us to come together. The new rule-based order has to be something that has stakeholdership as the basis. Not just big powers deciding and making it as a fait accompli for others. Since there is a mention about Belt and Road, many such formulations have emerged in the history. But, it has to be based, at least in the 21st century, it has to be based on the principle of stakeholdership. Have we been all consulted? Have we taken that decision collectively? Or it is offered as a fait accompli? So, these are the kind of things that we have to guard this region from. And guarding it again cannot be handed over to any one country or two countries. You know, the kind of dynamics that is emerging in this region also needs to be carefully watched. The new Cold War is emerging here. New Cold War. The 21st century Cold War probably will be fought in the Indian Ocean region. We have to guard against such an occurrence in this region. Again, you know, not to be offensive to any country. Since High Commissioner is next to me, my thoughts are going to Australia only all the time. I remember George Bush calling Australia as the deputy sheriff. Scott Morrison was the Prime Minister. It was in 2002. He called it the Deputy Sheriff of America in Indo-Pacific region. From there, 15 years down the line, today, the strongest relationship with that Australia has with any country in the Indo-Pacific region is in terms of its trade and economy with China. Countries are changing their relationships, changing the positions, because a new dynamic is emerging. This has to be handled carefully. All that I'm saying is, I'm not saying you can exclude this country or you exclude that country, but this is the reality of the situation. New forces are emerging. How do you balance it? How do you make it stakeholder-based principle, not something that is directed or offered as a fait accompli? I think that is where the challenge is going to lie for the next 10 or 15 years in this region.
Let me come to you, sir, for a quick intervention.
I just wanted
and then
to
I will
add
go to the final word.
as a clarification that
you get the final word. Yeah.
we as a country, Bangladesh, primarily look into both Indo-Pacific strategy and BRI, if that is at all a Indo-Pacific strategy. We look into it from development point of view, and that's why we believe it's complementary. It's not conflicting or contradictory.
I think that's a very fair point. Ma'am, the final word to you for this morning. And you can also respond to Mr. Madhav 2 or 3 times.
I didn't quite hear exactly what you said, but if you said Scott Morrison was the Prime Minister 15 years ago, that's not correct.
Who was the Prime Minister in 2002?
It would have been John Howard, our former Prime Minister John Howard. But if I can just make a broad point about some of the questions that were raised, about how we manage some of the transformation in the region. Clearly, it's really important to continue to foster good habits of dialogue and cooperation. We only get things done if we talk to each other. We have diplomats around the world who every day are trying to promote an open, prosperous and inclusive Indo-Pacific and are talking to their counterparts in other governments about how best we can progress this agenda and work constructively together. So that's the first thing. We need to make sure we sharpen those habits of dialogue and cooperation. Now, these often take place in established institutions. We've spoken a lot today about upholding the rules-based international order, and that means there are a number of institutions that discuss these issues and actually shape these rules and shape the norms that we want to support. But these institutions evolve. They change over time as the world changes. They transform, they adjust. Depending on what the political and strategic and economic interests are of the members, institutions change, and we've seen a great number of new institutions emerge that reflect the conversations that are needing to be had about shared interests. And these institutions don't only exist at the global level, but as we've talked about today, regionally, including in Indo-Pacific with the East Asia Summit Group, and the core of that is the ASEAN group, but there are also so many other groupings, including what we call cross-regional groupings like MICTA, or issues-based organisations such as IORA I spoke of earlier. But also we have organisations such as the Bali Process, that is a 45-member organisation that's designed to look at how we can work together to tackle issues of people smuggling and human trafficking and other transnational crimes, where there are technical workshops where people can exchange ideas and ways of tackling these shared concerns. So I think institutions evolve, they change, they adjust, and membership also changes. So I think we just need to be accepting of the fluidity of that. And the one last point I would make is around infrastructure. We've spoken a little bit about infrastructure, and I want to echo the points that Veerle made around the fact that there are huge infrastructure needs in the Indo-Pacific region. we support the growth in infrastructure, and all the infrastructure projects, if they adhere to a few key principles that are really important in our view. And those principles are around that they address genuine economic need, that they are transparent, and that there's open competition to participate in those projects, that coercion is not used in imposing projects on people, that they also uphold what we would consider to be robust international standards, and importantly, they don't impose an unmanageable debt burden on individual countries. So I think there's plenty of infrastructure work to be done, lots of opportunities, and if those principles are upheld, then I think that will be a great contribution to economic growth and connectivity in the region.
Thank you very much. I think let
it
me
was
apologize
John
to the
Howard.
gentleman who wanted to ask a
was
question.
John
I have to close this at this stage. You will have enough time over the next 1.5 days to discuss this in greater detail in different panels. Please join me in applauding the panelists for their intervention this morning. And they have given us enough food for thought to take forward in the rest of the panels that are going to be presented before you. The next one, which starts immediately now. I'm sorry, we are going to delay the lunch by a little bit. Tanubi, please take over and please call the next panel, and we will start lunch half an hour late this morning. Tanubi, please. Thank you very much.